day. It's you I live for every day. I'll follow after you every day. I'll walk with you, my Lord. It's you I live for every day.
Good afternoon. Hope you all are having a wonderful Easter. You know, when you look at history, you see that God's way has always been countercultural. As far back as you want to go back into the Old Testament, when God told His people how He wanted them to believe and how He wanted them to live, it stood in direct contradiction to the direction that the culture had gone. He says, I want you to worship one God. I want you to keep yourselves pure. And here's the world out there worshiping Chemosh and Molech and Dagon and all these false gods and pursuing all kinds of impurities. And God's way stands countercultural. You can go to the days of Jesus, and Jesus' teachings very countercultural to the Judaism of the day. That's one of the reasons why the Pharisees and Sadducees and Herodians and scribes and all these folks will stand in such opposition to Him, why they'll hate Him, and why they will be tickled to death to send Him to the cross. Today, Christianity stands directly counter to the cultures of the world. Not just the culture here in the West, but I mean Muslim culture, Buddhist culture, Hindu culture, atheistic culture. Christianity stands in direct contradiction to those cultures. Now, why is that? Well, it's because from the very beginning, God designed us and this world to operate in a certain way, hold certain truths, practice certain things, and what Scripture calls in 2 Corinthians 4 verse 4, the God of this world, the devil, is going to do everything he can to lead cultures directly away from that, to teach them a totally different set of values and a totally different way of doing things. And the fact of the matter is that God's way always works and the devil's way never does. And I think you can see that evidenced today by the mess that the world's in, as the world seeks to follow a culture that the God of this world has recommended instead of our one true God. Now, I said all that to say I don't think this is illustrated any clearer anywhere than in Ephesians 5 verse 21, where Paul is going to say, I want you to be subject to one another in submission to or in reverence of Christ. Now, in the culture of the day, it was no different then than it is now. The Romans were all about money, sex, and power. What are we all about today? We're all about money, sex, and power. As much of it as we can accumulate. We are all about figuring out how we can order other people around, be on top of the pyramid. I mean, that's how people live their lives today. That's the wisdom of the world. And it was then too. And what Paul says stands in direct contradiction to that. It's not, well, you're free to step on everybody and step over everybody in order to get where you want to go. He says, listen, I want you to submit to one another. I want you to be subject to one another. You're free, all right, but you're free to let go of your rights. You're free to pursue the needs and the desires of others before your own. That's about as contradictory to our culture as you can get. But what he says is beautiful, and it's absolutely right. God designed this world, and God designed us to operate in a certain way. And unfortunately, we don't do that today. The world operates pretty much in the opposite of that. And where today what we see is this emphasis on getting and controlling and having and directing and this kind of thing. God says where your interest needs to be, what you need to be pursuing is blessing the lives of others and seeking the welfare of others. And that involves being willing to submit to one another. Now, right after Paul says this, and I think this is very illustrative of the conflict that exists today, right after Paul says in Ephesians 5:21 that we are to be subject to one another, in the very next verse, he's going to tell wives to be subject to their husbands. Now, in this day and age, if you want to watch heads explode, just advocate that and watch a significant portion of our population go, well, that's patriarchal, that's dictatorial, that's horrible, that's backward. And I would argue it's exactly the opposite. It's beautiful. Because you see, these folks who are arguing that ignore the context, and I believe ignore what ultimately is a beautiful, healthy relationship. I am to be subject to Carol. That's what 5:21 says. Be subject to one another. As a husband to her, I am to be subject to her because she's one of those one another's, isn't she? Now the next verse directs her to be subject to me, but immediately after that, Paul's going to say, Dan, I want you to love Carol as Christ loved the church. Well, how did Christ love the church? With a self-giving, sacrificial love. Now, if I love my wife like Christ loved the church, and if I choose to be subject to my wife, how in the world can that be seen as dictatorial and patriarchal? It's anything but. It's beautiful. And that is the basis of a healthy marriage and any healthy relationship. Now, in a very practical way, let me talk for a second about this whole idea of submitting to one another, be subject to one another, and let me come at it from this angle, the one of communication. If I am subject to you, if I submit to you, I would argue, number one, that I'm going to listen to you. And I don't mean just noise while you talk and I'm trying to think of how I'm going to respond. I mean, no, I listen to you. We have a tendency, honestly, not to be very good listeners. I don't care if we're talking about in a marriage relationship, if we're talking about in a friendship, if we're talking about listening to instructions on the job. We always don't pay attention like we should. If I am subject to you, if I submit to you, then I am really going to listen carefully to what you say. That honors you, you see. That's just what you say is important, because it is. Jesus will tell his hearers, let he who has ears to hear, let him hear. I mean, he was concerned about the fact that there were people out there listening to him, but they weren't paying any attention. If I'm going to submit to you, if I'm going to be in subjection to you, I would argue, number one, I'm really going to listen to you. Number two, not only am I going to listen to you, but I am going to really weigh carefully and consider what you say. I'm going to take it seriously. You see, in this day and age, people may roll their eyes while they're listening to somebody, but they're not paying any attention to what they say. They're not honoring it. They don't care. They've already got their minds made up. That's not going to contribute to peace in relationships. That's not going to bring people together. That's going to go in the very opposite direction. If we are, out of reverence for Christ, out of reverence for our God, out of seeking to honor the way He designed things to be, if we're going to operate in that fashion, then I'm going to listen carefully to you, and I'm going to give weight to what you say. Through the years, I've been blessed to have some really great ideas shared with me by great writers, by great speakers, by those that are considered to be great thinkers, but also just in everyday conversation with brothers and sisters who have said some very profound things that have changed my life. We need to give weight to what others say, and if we're in subjection to them, if we submit to them, we're going to do that. And then thirdly, and very importantly, I'm going to listen to you. I'm going to give weight to what you say. And you know what? If it makes sense, and it'll work, and it's okay, and it's not immoral or ungodly, unbiblical, harmful, if it's none of those things, if it's just a matter of opinion, you know what? We're going to do it your way, not mine. Because you see, if I'm subjecting myself to you and submitting to you, then I want to see your way done. It's okay. It's no threat to me. I'm not losing my freedom if we have a discussion about where we're going to go eat or what we're going to eat or something like that. And I go, yeah, if that's what you want to do, that's fine. It's fine. I don't care. Isn't it amazing how the world operates better if we have the freedom not to try to impose always our will on others, no, it's going to have to be this way, but instead to just relax and enjoy what others say and what others think and what others want to do, and honor that and see their joy and see their happiness. Isn't that a beautiful picture? God says, that's how I want you to operate, okay? That's how I want my people to live. Now, is that going to stand in contradiction to the culture? Oh, it absolutely is. But is it going to make for the very best quality of life possible among God's people? I would argue it absolutely is. As we discuss this passage, keep these thoughts in mind, and let's share ways in which, in a meaningful way, we can truly submit to one another. God bless.
Love one another. Serve one another. Pray for each other. Encourage one another.